Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today as we begin our exploration into Struggle at the Edge of the World, Operation Highjump. Operation Highjump is something that's been covered extensively by various researchers for years, especially since the 21st century. It is an operation that occurred just after World War II, during what was considered one of the most watershed years in history, 1947, although the operation itself started in 1946. Many key events occurred in 1947 that were new order defining, if you will. But let's take a look at how Operation Highjump is perceived. And here, from the World of Warships history, we have the Battle of Antarctica, a decisive moment in the war. Let's investigate the 100% historically accurate gravity-defying saucers of Antarctica. And of course, here we have the dramatic picture of destroyers engaging a flying saucer. We're talking about the well-known Battle of Antarctica, also known as Operation Highjump, during which in 1946 USA task forces went to Antarctica to destroy the remaining bases of the Fourth Reich, maybe they mean the Third, or that could have been changed for the game, and capture a new unique armament, flying saucers. However, on March 3, 1947, the squadron was attacked by the enemy and forced to flee. The expedition failed, but 71 years later, players have a chance for a rematch. In the mode, a team of 12 ships will face 12 flying saucers. So it's a game, and it's fantasy, and it's enjoyable. However, this is actually a common perception about one of the reasons that this operation was launched in 1946. And that was the thought that there was potentially a U-boat base of the Third Reich that had survived the end of World War II and was still being used in New Swabia in Antarctica. That's one theory. There's also other theories that Operation Highjump was seeking a gateway to an inner world, an outer world, or something completely beyond our understanding. This video is going to focus on the historical and mainstream account, and the reason for that is while we have fantastic claims of flying saucers, gateways to other worlds, and we will consider those theories, especially in the third part, we're going to focus on the mainstream account because the mainstream account alone has many different anomalies and contradictions to it, and we want to examine each one of those. And in and of itself, it's a remarkable account that doesn't make a lot of sense and is yet another one that creates more questions than it answers. So let's take a look and see what the mainstream says about Operation Highjump. Operation Highjump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program 1946 to 1947, also called Task Force 68. So you see why they went with the operation title. That's definitely nothing that inspires imagination. Nice and boring and very bureaucratic. Was a United States Navy operation to establish the Antarctic research base Little America 4. The operation was organized by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, Jr., USN Retired Officer in Charge, Task Force 68, and led by Rear Admiral Ethan Eric Larson, USN Commanding Officer, Task Force 68. So already we have an interesting conflict with the operation being planned by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, which most people know was the senior officer responsible for the operation, but then we have a reference here to Rear Admiral Ethan Eric Larson, who does not appear to have an entry in Wikipedia, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. One of the things the U.S. military prides itself on, and a lesson that it had learned and applied very well in World War II, was called the unified chain of command. There's one person in charge. Yet we know, or believe, that Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd accompanied the operation and was the commander on the ground. So we're definitely going to have to look into that. Operation Highjump commenced 26 August 1946 and ended in late February 1947. Task Force 68 included 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. Very sizable contingent, especially for something going to the edge of the world, or something as remote as we believe and know Antarctica to be. Highjump's objectives, according to the U.S. Navy report of the operation, were training personnel and testing equipment in frigid conditions. Well, why did they need to go to the Antarctica for that? The Arctic and even Alaska and the Arctic Circle is much closer to the United States, but never mind. Consolidating and extending the United States sovereignty over the largest practicable area of the Antarctic continent, publicly denied as a goal before the expedition ended. Okay, so they were looking for a land grab. Fair enough. Determining the feasibility of establishing, maintaining, and utilizing bases in the Antarctic and investigating possible base sites. Okay, again, makes sense. developing techniques for establishing, maintaining, and utilizing air bases on ice with particular attention to later applicability of such techniques to operations in interior Greenland, where conditions are comparable to those in the Antarctic. Well, that's interesting. Opposite sides of the world as we know it, but all right. Amplifying existing stores of knowledge of electromagnetic, geological, geographic, hydrographic, and meteorological propagation conditions in the area. Interesting. Supplementary objectives of the Nanook expedition, a smaller equivalent conducted off eastern Greenland. So it's very intriguing. We have these bizarre connections with Greenland and the Antarctic. We have apparently the main goal being to train personnel and test equipment in frigid conditions, which are many locations that are much more geographically convenient to the United States Navy and where it was based, especially after World War II. We have this very large contingent. Now, of course, you go back to World War II, yes, we had armies and navies that were hundreds of thousands of personnel. But still, 4,700, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. We also have to put that in the context that in 1946, the mighty United States military machine was disarming and demobilizing, namely because it was to save money. And a few short years later, the United States Navy would find itself very hard-pressed to initially prosecute the Korean War because of cutbacks during the Truman era. But nevertheless, it is remarkable that this operation was launched with this amount of resources with these objectives. It already brings into mind questions with who was actually in command. Why was the person who planned it not actually the person who commanded on the ground in the operation? I mean, it's not completely without merit because that happens a lot within the U.S. military and all of the branches, but you would think they would want someone who had a lot of experience, which Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd did. But we're going to have to look deeper into who were the individuals responsible for launching this operation. We also have to look at the greater picture of what was going on in the world in 1946. So to gain a better understanding of what the situation in the United States was in 1946, we have to examine the biography of James Forrestal. James Forrestal served under President Harry S. Truman, and everyone knows Harry S. Truman as the United States president that succeeded Roosevelt at the tail end of World War II, who approved the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. Forrestal is a very interesting individual. He was the last cabinet-level United States Secretary of the Navy and the first United States Secretary of Defense. Forrestal came from a very strict middle-class Irish Catholic family. He was a successful financier on Wall Street before becoming Undersecretary of the Navy in 1940. Shortly before the United States entered Second World War, he became Secretary of the Navy in May 1944 upon the death of his superior, Colonel Frank Knox. President Franklin D. Roosevelt requested that Forrestal take the lead in building up the Navy. In 1947, after the end of the war, President Harry S. Truman appointed him the first Secretary of the newly created Department of Defense. Forrestal was intensely hostile to the Soviet Union, fearing communist expansion in Europe and the Middle East. Along with Secretary of State George C. Marshall, he strongly opposed the United States' support for the establishment of the State of Israel, fearing that this would alienate Arab nations which were needed as allies, and whose petroleum reserves were vital for both military and civilian industrial expansion. So again, you see right here, the end of World War II, this is where the new order started, and you can see where a lot of the debates that persist to this day also began. Forrestal was a supporter of naval battle groups centered on aircraft carriers. In World War II, in the Pacific Theater, the United States Navy was, quite frankly, the center of gravity, especially the Pacific Fleet, the center of gravity being defined operationally as the doer that won the war. Without the United States Navy, the United States could not have won the war in the Pacific, since it being a very large ocean, the largest in the world. He tried to weaken the proposed Department of Defense for the Navy's benefit, but was hard-pressed to run it from 1947 to 1949 after Truman named him Secretary of Defense. The two men were often at odds, and Truman forced Forrestal's resignation. Here's where it gets interesting. Thereafter, Forrestal's mental health rapidly deteriorated, declining to the point in which he underwent medical care for depression. While a patient at Bethesda Naval Hospital, Forrestal died by suicide from fatal injuries sustained after falling out a 16th floor window. In 1954, the United States Navy's new supercarrier was named USS Forrestal in his honor, as is the James V. Forrestal Building, which houses the headquarters of the United States Department of Energy. Interesting thing to name after him. He is the namesake of the Forrestal Lecture Series at the United States Naval Academy and of the James Forrestal campus of his alma mater, Princeton University. What's truly remarkable about James Forrestal, aside from the fact that he was the first Secretary of Defense, was that he was also the Secretary of Defense during some very defining moments for what would become the Cold War, the East West conflict, both hot and cold, that would follow. Many of the policies that he advocated did end up becoming policies that were adopted by the United States. It should be noted that while he was a proponent for the United States Navy, as soon as he was removed as Secretary of Defense, the United States Navy was cut back severely by his successor and under the behest of President Truman. And this created a very difficult situation when the Korean War started, as Truman ordered a blockade imposed on North Korea and was told by the Navy that they did not have sufficient forces to do so. So it's interesting that we have this individual who seems to come from a background where he was conflicted with President Truman, but he was in good standing with President Roosevelt. Now, is this real? Is this just something that was put on for our benefit? Is this just the history that we know? We're going off the mainstream account because there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of conflicts. And it starts with James Forrestal and just his very colored history, brief history as Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense. I remember Robert Heinlein had a saying in his book Starship Troopers, "No Department of Defense ever won a war." And it's interesting when you look at the performance of the Department of Defense with the United States, and it's arguable that they've decisively won a war in which situations. Well, you could say that they won every tactical engagement, but strategically, it's definitely a matter of debate. Now let's look into Richard E. Byrd, the planner and supposed commander of this operation. Rear Admiral, 08, United States Navy, veteran of the U.S. Naval Academy, United States Navy 1912 to 1927, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. Richard Byrd was born on October 25, 1888 in Winchester, Virginia. He served in the battleship fleet until 1916 when he was medically retired, but soon returned to active duty in a retired status where he organized the Commission on Training Camps. He then completed flight training and was designated Naval Aviator number 608 in April 1918. Byrd served in Canada as commander of U.S. Naval Air Forces during World War I, and then after the war he served in Washington, D.C., where he was responsible for the navigational preparations for the transatlantic flight attempt of the NC flying boats in 1919. He flew over the interior of Greenland in 1925 and was the first person credited with flying over the North Pole on May 9, 1926. For this feat, he was awarded a rare Peacetime Medal of Honor. Medal of Honor is the highest award in the United States military, and it's not something they just throw out. It's also interesting to note that the Medal of Honor had its incipience during the, you guessed it, United States Civil War. Byrd left active duty in 1927 and led an expedition to Antarctica from 1928 to 1930, and during this time he made the first flight over the South Pole in November 1929. So how many other people in the world supposedly flew over both poles? Very intriguing. He led a second expedition to Antarctica from 1933 to 1935 and a third one from 1939 to 1940. Byrd was recalled to active duty with the Navy in March 1940 and served in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations throughout the war, mainly serving as a consultant and surveying areas in both the Pacific Theater and the European Theater. Admiral Byrd led Operation Highjump to Antarctica in 1946 and again retired from active duty in 1947. He was put in charge of the U.S. Antarctic programs in 1956 and died at his home in Boston, Massachusetts on March 11, 1957. Richard Byrd is buried with his wife Marie at Arlington National Cemetery. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "For distinguishing himself conspicuously by courage and intrepidity at the risk of his life, in demonstrating that it is possible for aircraft to travel in continuous flight from a now inhabited portion of the Earth over the North Pole and return." So very fascinating. It seems like this was a naval officer who seemed to keep being retired and then keep being recalled to active duty. It almost reads like a plot from a movie where you have the grand hero that they can never just let go, and they just keep pulling back and calling him back and calling him back. Medically retired in 1916 when he was 28 years old, 29 years old. It's very interesting, and yet they just keep bringing him back. So even in looking at the biography, and this is from an actual veteran tribute, there's a lot of questions that come up about Richard Byrd, and there's certainly a lot of things that are said about him in many different circles about what societies he was a member of or who he truly represented. But again, we're just looking at the mainstream, and here we have a naval officer whose career is quite interesting and quite unique. And again, it reads like it's something out of a movie. He's retired. Okay, we need to call him back. He's retired again. Okay, we're going to call him back. Oh, it's World War I, World War II. Although it's interesting because he was initially retired at the end of World War I. So I don't know. It's almost as though the biography is confusing in and of itself. All right, let's look at a different account of Operation Highjump. But even going off of the mainstream account, we already have several conflicts and contradictions that are raising more questions. Background: Operation Highjump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, 1946-47, okay, that sounds right, was a United States Navy operation organized by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, Junior Officer in Charge, Task Force 68, and led by Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen, USN Commanding Officer. Wait a minute. That sounds different than Rear Admiral Ethan Larson, which is what the Wikipedia account gave us. Yes, Rear Admiral Ethan Eric Larson. So again, who was really in command on the ground? Different sources seem to cite different officers. You'd think that's kind of an important thing. Who was the senior officer in charge on the ground? Operation Highjump commenced 26 August 1946 and ended in late February 1947. Task Force 68 included 4,700 men, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft. The primary mission of Operation Highjump was to establish the Antarctic research base, Little America 4. So is that how they were going to achieve all those objectives, by establishing this research base? And this is very intriguing. Well, let's look at this account from our friends at Smithsonian. Operation Highjump. A year after World War II ended, the United States Navy mounted a massive, though hastily planned mission to the bottom of the world. The three Navy airmen who in 1946 became the first U.S. casualties in Antarctica, see Executive Editor Paul Hoversten, asked Diane Olson Bellinger, a historian of polar exploration and the author of Deep Freeze, the United States, the International Geophysical Year, and the Origins of Antarctica's Age of Science. Try saying that 6 times fast. What a title. University Press of Colorado, 2006, to talk about Highjump and its legacy. Air and Space. What was the significance of Operation Highjump? Bellinger, our official accredited historian who can tell us the difference between a conspiracy theory, what's fact, and what's fiction. No U.S. naval expedition had been in Antarctica for 100 years before that, not since the Charles Wilkes expedition of 1838-42. Highjump was a significant illustration of the state of the world and the Cold War thinking at the time. The nuclear age had just begun, and the real fears were that the Soviet Union would attack the United States over the North Pole. Okay, let's think about this. 1946, the United States is the only nation that has not suffered extreme industrial damage during World War II. There were no major battles that occurred anywhere on the continental United States, and just a few islands that were touched by any action at all. The United States had the remaining industrial super strength of the world. And yes, I use the word super strength because that's exactly what it was. They had expanded the industrial capacity and had built a mighty military machine. They had also assisted their allies in doing so. And more importantly, which is not mentioned here, the United States was the only nation in the world at that time that possessed nuclear weapons. They had used nuclear weapons in combat and they had tested them. Nobody else had nuclear weapons. No one else should have been able to match the United States in simple military might at that time on that basis alone. And yet here we are with this statement that, well, the nuclear age had just begun. But the Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapons yet, and it would be a few years before they would even detonate their first successful nuclear weapon. So quite fascinating. The Navy had done a training exercise there in the summer of 1946 and felt it needed to do more. Why? The northern winter was coming, and Highjump was a quickly planned exercise to move the whole thing to the South Pole. Again, why? Politically, the orders were that the Navy should do all it could to establish a basis for a land claim in Antarctica. That was classified at the time. And again, why? Why is Antarctica so strategically valuable? You would think, or at least understand, if they were concerned about attack from the Soviet Union coming over the Arctic, that would make a lot more sense. But we're going to go run off down to the Antarctica on the opposite side of the world for reasons. Okay. Admiral Richard Byrd, who led the Highjump expedition, had 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 men. Quite a contingent, no doubt. Ballinger. It was the largest naval expedition ever in Antarctica. Ever in Antarctica. Even the Operation Deep Freeze expeditions during the International Geophysical Year in the 1950s were a fraction of that. These were also newly released soldiers and sailors from World War II, and there were very few of those 4,700 who had any polar experience. So why were they running them down there? So it's a little odd that they would have conjured up so many. Yes, I completely agree with Bellinger, the author here. The leadership ranks were very thin, especially in the flying ranks. That really doesn't make any sense, because in the flying ranks, regardless of which branch or even what military across the world you're in, they're always replete with officers. Was Byrd able to accomplish all his objectives? No. Admiral Byrd by then was a minor player. His name was, of course, illustrious, and they wanted to make use of that. But in fact, while he had the titular control of the operation, the Navy really called the shots. Now, is that from the two different named commanding officers that we had, or isn't that the way it always is in any military operation? The branch of the military calls the shots, ultimately under the president, because according to the Constitution, the president is the commander-in-chief, and therefore, technically, the senior military commander of the United States military, who everyone answers to. So is Harry S. Truman sitting up in his office personally micromanaging this little Operation Highjump? Who knows? From the research I've done, Byrd really wasn't well. He never really recovered, according to people who knew him, from his time alone on the ice in 1934. As for the exercise, it was so brief and cobbled together. It was so brief and cobbled together, and yet they sent 4,700 service members down to the Antarctic. Okay. They were supposed to do a lot of photo mapping, but as one of the pilots, Conrad Gus Shin, who flew Douglas R-4Ds from the carrier USS Philippine Sea, told me, we didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't know about precision flying or what we were looking at. So why were they doing this? The only casualties on High Jump are the 3 Navy men killed in the George I airplane crash in December 1946. Do you think the Navy should recover their bodies? Interesting question to ask. Well, there are also bodies from Operation Deep Freeze, and there's been no attempt to get them either. In Deep Freeze 1, there were 2 deaths. One was on a tractor that went through the ice right when they got there in January 1956. Later, another tractor went down into a crevasse as its driver was crushed. There were maybe 4 deaths in Deep Freeze 2 or 3. Maybe. Okay. And they're still happening. It's still a dangerous place. Well, any place can be a dangerous place if you're not practicing caution and aware. Where that high jump crash was sounded to me to be in a pretty tough place. Interesting choice of words. When some of them were rescued, they were asked to walk the 9 or 10 miles to shore because no airplane could land there to pick them up. They called it the Phantom Coast because you could never find it. How did High Jump help lay the foundation for further U.S. exploration of the continent? It was the beginning of the photo mapping there, and it helped people learn about the continent. When the IGY scientists, who of course were sitting in conference halls in Europe, were planning where to put stations in Antarctica during the IGY, they used what the High Jump people had learned to help them make decisions. For example, there was a discovery over in East Antarctica of an ice-free area that was bedrock and had water pockets that guided the building of stations there. It carries the name Bunger Hills after the high jump pilot who first flew over it. So interesting, a cobbled together, thrown together operation, and yet the results of it were used to plan where they were going to locate basing. All right. Very intriguing. We get so many different conflicting stories about Operation High Jump already that it's already created more questions than it answers. We're not even considering the fact that there could have been other purposes for this operation. Just looking at its stated purposes, the lack of unification in the chain of command, the tremendous size of the expedition that they sent down there, and yet personnel on the ground saying they didn't really have any idea what they were doing down there, but then the conclusion was it was very successful. It helped them locate basing. Intriguing indeed. Let's take a look at the composition of this expeditionary force, Task Force 68. Okay, so here we have Richard Harold Cruzen, and he appears to have been the on-the-ground commander instead of Richard E. Byrd. All right. What do we have? We have a seaplane tender. Okay, that makes sense. We have a destroyer. It's interesting that they're sending a destroyer down there on this expedition to the Antarctica. We have a tanker. All right, that makes sense. You need to have supply. Ships need oil. Planes need oil and gas. Seaplane tender. Destroyer. Tanker. Communications flagship. Supply ships. We got a submarine. A Ballo-class submarine. Now, why did they need a submarine? That's very interesting. Something to really think about. Icebreakers, okay, that probably makes the most sense of any of those types of ships that you have in the composition of this expeditionary force. And then here we have Richard E. Byrd himself, officer in charge. Okay, so Richard H. Cruzen was the commander of Task Force 68, but Richard E. Byrd was the officer in charge of the overall expedition, and it looks like they were same rank. That must have been something interesting to sort out in the chain of command, or were they just on the radio talking to the Secretary of the Navy / Secretary of Defense Forrestal at that time? It's just something interesting to consider. Before the age of satellites and satellite communication. That's a whole nother discussion. Aircraft carrier and flagship USS Philippine Sea. So they had an aircraft carrier. Now you might be wondering, is this one of those smaller aircraft carriers? Oh no, this is an Essex-class aircraft carrier. There were only 24 of them built during World War II, and just for context, the Essex-class aircraft carrier was the United States' primary ship of the line. Forrestal believed in ships that were built around carrier task forces, and the Essex-class was its supercarrier of the day. Now, they didn't call it a supercarrier, but when you look up the specifics on the Essex class, it was supposed to be a carrier that was larger than anything the Japanese Navy had, 880 feet length and displacing 27,000 tons. Just a very large aircraft carrier. And interestingly enough, the Essex class did evolve into a much larger and more modern carrier with the angled flight deck as they continue to evolve going forward. So the USS Philippine Sea being on this operation, and something else to know about Essex class carriers is they can carry up to 90 to 100 aircraft. So very large ship, large crew, capital ship on its own as part of this expeditionary force going to the Antarctica. It's very remarkable. It doesn't make a lot of sense because what you'd expect would probably be a composition of more icebreakers and something more of smaller research ships. The supply ships make sense. The seaplane tenders even make sense, but we've got destroyers, we've got a carrier, we've got a submarine. So we do have the ability to project some firepower, and we do have a lot of personnel with this expedition. So the composition of it raises more questions as well. What were they really being sent down there for? Why were they so well armed and equipped? I mean, they could have sent what they called escort carriers from World War II. They were smaller carriers that were converted to supply ships. They had all kinds of options. It wasn't as though there was any shortage of types of ships that they could have pulled up right at the end of World War II. So they assembled this force. They gathered these individuals who were told were veterans of World War II. And hey, guess what, everyone? We're going to the Antarctica for reasons. I wonder what they were told. It's interesting when you get the account of the one pilot that we looked at earlier who said he had no idea what they were doing down there or what their true goals were. This is interesting. A Sikorsky R-4 helicopter. So 1946, 1947, and a helicopter in their infancy. Now, most people remember the use of helicopters in the TV series MASH, which was set during the Korean War, and that wasn't until 1950 to 1953. So just remarkable. So many intricacies and questions with this overall operation already. So just in looking at the overall mission of Operation Highjump, we're left with a number of interesting considerations and questions. We have a nation that is now at the pinnacle of its ability to project national power at the end of World War II. There is no other nation that can match it in terms of raw military capability, industrial might, and its simple possession of atomic weapons. And yet it embarks on what is supposedly a hastily planned expedition that clearly had the involvement of the Secretary of Defense and former Secretary of the Navy, an individual who was at odds with his president and then eventually committed suicide. And he was clearly read in on many of the opening events of the Cold War, and no doubt other questionable incidents that remain with us to this day, such as the Roswell incident and many other things with the establishment of the Cold War. Also, many interesting questions about why the United States didn't use its monopoly on nuclear weapons to achieve a nuclear dominance going forward. That's always been a question in my mind. Now, I'm not saying that's the right course of action. I'm not saying that that's morally correct, but When you look at the fact that this was the nation that did use nuclear weapons in combat, why didn't they try to employ some sort of brinksmanship to achieve a nuclear dominance? And yet, the story we get is that President Truman said, well, the United States would never be a nation that would launch a sneak attack. Although that's not even what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about utilizing threat of force to maintain a dominance. Nothing about it really makes a lot of sense. So you go from that to Secretary of Defense who committed suicide, was at odds with his president. And then we have this situation with Richard E. Byrd, a guy who had an exceptional career, but then also a storybook career, somebody who was retired and kept getting called back to active service for unknown reasons. Although he just that good and they just couldn't let him go. I mean, it's possible. But then there's also conflict with who is actually commanding the task force. There's multiple individuals listed. It could just be errors, but was Admiral Byrd really the commander of the expedition? Was he the commander of the task force? Was he the overall commander on the ground? The article said the Navy was in command. Well, of course it was, but when they're this far away, how exactly are they talking every day to the Navy? They're given orders and they're given disciplined initiative and intent, and they have to accomplish their mission. The only thing the sources really seem to agree on is the composition, which is vast, 4,700 personnel, a task force of ships, which includes an Essex-class aircraft carrier, a submarine, and multiple destroyers. A lot of firepower to be sending on what's either a research expedition. So it raises many questions. And this picture here is a picture of Little America 4, the base that was established for Operation Highjump. And you can see it's a very extensive layout with what appears to be ships and it looks like tents or bivouac area. It's quite remarkable when you consider all the detail that went into this, and yet they claim that this was a hastily planned operation, that they called Richard E. Byrd out of retirement again to pull it off. And he wasn't done. He'd be back in the 1950s as well. This is just the start of the operation. This is just the mission. Please join me next week, Sunday, as we go into part 2, the expedition. As always, I appreciate you being here. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. President Roosevelt's order of November 25, 1939 to Admiral Byrd. My dear Admiral Byrd, by the Second Deficiency Appropriation Act, fiscal year 1939, and the Urgent Deficiency and Supplemental Appropriation Act, approved June 30, 1939, the Congress has made available to the Department of the Interior under the heading Expenses, Division of Territories and Island Possessions, a total of $350,000 for an investigation and survey of natural resources of the land and sea areas of the Antarctic regions. I have designated the organization of the government activities in the Antarctic undertaken in pursuance of the foregoing congressional authorization as the United States Antarctic Service. I requested the Secretaries of State, the Treasury and Navy, and the Interior each to designate a representative to form a committee for the purpose of organizing, directing, and coordinating the conduct of the investigation authorized by the Congress. This committee is designated the Executive Committee of the United States Antarctic Service. It shall have authority to appoint an executive secretary who shall perform such duties as may be assigned to him by the committee. Because of your expertise and brilliant achievements in polar exploration, and because of the confidence which the people of the United States have in you and your qualities of leadership, I have designated you commanding officer of the United States Antarctic Service and an ex officio member of the Executive Committee. The principal objective in the field is the delineation of the continental coastline between the meridians 72 degrees west and 148 degrees west and the consolidation of the geographical features of Hearst Land, James W. Ellsworth Land, and Marie Byrd Land. It is desired that long-range aerial flights equipped with mapping cameras consolidate these areas. If practicable, supply caches to extend the cruising range of the planes should be established. Flights in this area should be made from the USS Bear, if practicable, and such flights, so far as possible, should be planned to supplement previous flights which have been made along the 75th, 101st, 116th, 134th, 150th, and 152nd meridians of west longitude. The communication system of the Antarctic Service is an integral part of the Naval Communication System as outlined in separate correspondence by the Chief of Naval Operations and is governed by the U.S. Navy Communication Instructions. In this connection, those circuits authorized by the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, the U.S. Army, and the Federal Communications Commission are restricted to the specific use intended and by their respective governing regulations. You will direct base leaders and members of the scientific staff of the service to maintain journals of the progress of the service and enter thereon events, observations, and remarks. You will prohibit all those under your command from furnishing any person not belonging to the Antarctic Service with copies of any journal, diary, chart, plan, memorandum, specimen, drawing, painting, photograph, film, plate, or information of any kind which has reference to the object, progress, or proceedings of the Antarctic Service. As it is highly important that no journal or narrative of the enterprise, either partial or complete, should be published without the authority and under the supervision of the government of the United States, at whose expense this service is undertaken, you will, before they reach the first port north of the Antarctic regions, require from every person under your command the surrender of all journals, diaries, memoranda, remarks, writings, charts, drawings, sketches, paintings, photographs, films, plates, as well as all specimens of every kind, collected or prepared during their absence from the United States. Such articles may be returned to the person concerned or not at the option of the Executive Committee, but such writer in the published records shall receive credit for such part or parts of his material as may be used in said records. You will bring these instructions to the attention of every person under your command, but you will give them no other publicity until authorized to do so by the Executive Committee. Very sincerely yours, signed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All right, thank you to the Freedom of Information Act. We do have access to the debriefing. That is the final report that was submitted from the commander of Task Force 68, and this does confirm the name of the individual is R.H. Cruzen, although there's some interesting discrepancies as we read through this report, and I'll call them out as we go. Now, this could simply be because of the fact that my experience in the United States military is more late 20th, early 21st century, and this could be simply military process and procedures of the time right after World War II. But nevertheless, many things stand out in this to me. From Commander Task Force 68, which was the primary formation operating under Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who was the officer in charge of the Antarctic Developments Project 1947. Should note that the reference says CTF 68 Op Plan 246 dated 20 November 1946. That's critical because all World War II casualties fall under consideration through December of 1946. So, if there were casualties from this operation. They would fall under the overall casualty umbrella of World War II casualties. The Antarctic Developments Project, 1947, identified by the code word Highjump and established by the Chief of Naval Operations by enclosure. This directive charged the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Atlantic Fleet, with this operational and administrative control of the project. Technical control was retained by the Chief of Naval Operations and was exercised with the assistance of Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, retired, who was designated as officer in charge of the project and who locally exercised technical control while present in the Antarctic. That in and of itself is rather confusing jargon and language, and it seems to indicate a lack of a unified chain of command, although maybe I'm just reading too much into it. Operational and administrative instructions for the conduct of the project were issued to the task force commander by the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Atlantic Fleet, in a letter of instructions dated 15 October 1946. Okay, answering to multiple commanders, but no biggie. Prior to the departure of Task Force 68 for the conduct of Operation Nanook in the Arctic, July-September 1946, the Task Force commander was informed that preliminary discussions were being held regarding an operation to be held in the Antarctic during the forthcoming winter. So we're going to the Arctic and now we're going to the Antarctic. As a result, some preliminary planning was done by the staff during the operational period of Nanook, and during the latter part of the operation, some of the key members of the staff were retained by air to augment the planning staff, which was being assembled with the rear echelon at the Navy Department. However, full-scale planning did not begin until the latter part of September upon the return of the task force from the Atlantic. As eventually organized, the task force consisted of 13 ships, 7 ships from the Atlantic Fleet, plus the U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker Northwind on loan from the Coast Guard. On loan? Not attached, not TACON, not OPCON, not an official military term. It's just on loan. Okay, fine. It's on loan, and 5 ships from the Pacific Fleet. Aircraft assigned were, and he goes through the listing of aircraft. Interestingly enough, includes the 2 helicopters, although the contingent of aircraft seems very, very light, especially since they had an aircraft carrier that could hold 90 to 100 aircraft, but we'll overlook that for now. Total naval and marine personnel participating was slightly in excess of 4,700 officers and men. In addition, 8 U.S. Army observers, 25 civilian observers from various agencies of the U.S. government, and 11 radio and press correspondents participated in the operation. And no doubt all of them fell under the presidential executive order that they would not talk about this unless explicitly approved by the aforementioned committee that we saw in President Roosevelt's letter to Admiral Byrd. Now, some people say, well, that letter was written in 1939 and it was a different Antarctic agency, etc., etc., etc. Well, here's the thing. Presidential orders and mandates will apply until they are officially revoked, and they can always be brought back, especially in court-martial proceedings, which if anybody under this operation decided to go outside the realm of, they would be facing justice under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which can be quite, how shall we say, difficult if you're going against the chain of command, especially the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. The short period available for planning and preparation required strenuous work on the part of all. Many of the ships were in an inactive status, and all were well below peacetime complements. All aircraft required winterization and some alterations. Little time was available for the training and indoctrination of the hastily assembled crews of the ships and aircraft. So they threw this together. They didn't have any of the ships ready because they were already in mothball after World War II, and somehow they managed to pull all this off. Well, it's the military. They can do amazing things, and I don't say that in jest. They can move mountains when they really have to, but it's amazing how much additional challenge there was imposed in this. Much specialized equipment had to be assembled and modified for the special conditions to be encountered, especially that for the base at Little America. The departure date of 2 December 1946 could not have been met except for the splendid cooperation of various bureaus and agencies of the Navy Department and of numerous commands afloat and ashore. And then he recounts the objectives, which do match the objectives that we saw that were listed: training personnel and testing equipment, and consolidating, extending United States sovereignty. Well, here it says it very, very clearly in a debriefing. So yes, I can't see how they can deny it there. Okay. Well, let's see what else he has to say in the debriefing. So lists out the task forces, and there we go, the carrier group, Philippine Sea. Its specific task to transport 6 R-4D airplanes to a position north of Little America and to northward of the main continental ice pack, and to launch these aircraft for flight to Little America. They needed an Essex-class aircraft carrier to do that. They couldn't have pulled up one of the old escort carriers. And I know, I'm trying to make sense of all this, but It's just amazing that they had to send a large fleet carrier to accomplish this mission. Not necessarily by itself, but the way it's organized, it seems like the carrier group is operating by itself. Since when did a carrier just operate by itself without any kind of escorts? Even in the Antarctic. It just doesn't match naval doctrine, and it certainly doesn't match naval doctrine that had just been mastered in World War II with the fast carrier attack groups. They always had escort ships, destroyers, cruisers, and various other supporting ships. I mean, they had the supporting ships, but this just doesn't make any sense. The carrier was off on its own? Okay. Do they have the submarine listed? Oh, there it is, the Senate. I just wanted to look at that mission. Tasked to establish a temporary base and airstrip in the vicinity of Little America, Antarctica, transporting and landing required material and personnel to conduct systemic long-range air exploration and associated operations, and to carry out assigned projects for training naval personnel, testing materials, and amplifying existing scientific knowledge of the Antarctic. What the heck did you need a submarine for to do that then? And keep in mind that at that time, they didn't have the hunter-killer concept with submarines. In other words, one submarine could not engage and destroy another submarine underwater. There was one confirmed report of one submarine sinking another submarine in all of World War II, and that occurred on the surface. So, again, so many inconsistencies already with this report, right down to even how it's written, but let's continue. The operational phase began on 2 December 1946 with the departure of the majority of the ships from ports on the east and west coast of the United States, and was considered terminated with the return of the task force flagship to Washington, D.C. on 14 April 1947. Details of operations are contained in the narratives of the task group commanders and of the commanding officers of the ships participating, annexed here too. Had circumstances permitted, a departure date approximately 2 weeks earlier would have been advantageous, particularly for the eastern and western groups. This would have permitted them to profit by the comparatively favorable flying conditions that prevail in the Antarctic during the latter half of December. Under the unusually severe ice conditions existing this year in the Ross Sea, it is doubtful if the ships of the Central Group could have reached Little America at a materially early date. However, had the icebreaker started a reconnaissance of the passage into the Ross Sea some 2 weeks earlier, it is quite probable that the passage of the unprotected ships through the ice pack to the Bay of Whales would have been facilitated. Operations of the eastern and western groups in the Antarctic were continued as long as practicable. They were terminated at approximately the day anticipated by the approach of the winter season, with accompanying bad weather and shorter periods of daylight. The Central Group was forced to withdraw from the base at Little America 2 to 3 weeks earlier than anticipated due to the unusually heavy pack ice in the Ross Sea, with the consequent danger of the ships being beset by consolidation of the ice floes during an early freeze of the Ross Sea. All ships of the Central Group suffered damage of varying degrees to hulls and propellers, none of which was serious except for the loss of the Merrick's rudder. That's pretty serious. This accident occurred while the Merrick was maneuvering in heavy pack ice with the wind of approximately 40 knots and while withdrawing from the Ross Sea. The Pine Islands propeller was damaged by ice and was replaced by an onboard spare upon return to Panama. One seaplane and 2 helicopters crashed and were lost. In addition, one seaplane was lost overboard from the flight deck of the Currituck during heavy weather. This gets more interesting. There were 7 deaths during the operation. 3 members of the crew of the seaplane, which crashed and burned on Eights Peninsula, were killed. In addition, one of the survivors of this accident had both legs amputated below the knee as a result of injuries during the crash and subsequent frostbite. One man from the Yancey was killed as a result of an unloading accident at the Bay of Whales. 2 men from the Western Group were killed in an automobile accident while on liberty in Sydney, Australia. And 1 man from the Mount Olympus was drowned in Panama. This latter man was over leave and was attempting to avoid detection by swimming back to the ship. Okay. And he puts this all in the official report. Well, he's being very thorough in that aspect. With one exception, the major objectives of the operation were accomplished. Initial plans contemplated construction at Little America of a matted airstrip for use by aircraft on wheels. This project was not initiated due to the delay in reaching Little America and early realization that the severe ice conditions encountered in the Ross Sea would require evacuation of all personnel and ships from Little America at a considerably earlier date than originally hoped. However, considerable experimental work was done along this line, and it is believed that an acceptable technique has been developed for the construction of an airstrip on snow-covered glacial ice for use of aircraft on wheels. Much information of value to the naval services and of scientific interest was obtained. Details of observation results are contained in the various annexes. Of course, it's in the annexes. All data relative to geographical discoveries and mapping, together with certain scientific data, have been turned over to the Hydrographic Office, Washington, D.C., for evaluation and processing. It is estimated 2 years will be required to complete this work, and until it is done, why is it going to take 2 years? Wow. That's pretty telling right there. And until this is done, it is not possible to assess accurately the results or extent of this work. He's talking about the mapping work. 2 years? What is going on? It is presently estimated that 1,500,000 square miles of the Antarctic continent were sighted, about 700,000 square miles of which were previously unexplored. Much of this area was covered by aerial photographs. These figures are approximate only and are subject to revision upon completion of the work now in progress in the Hydrographic Office. Ships, track charts, and flight charts of aircraft from the various task groups are contained in annexes to this report and give the general location of the areas covered. Strictly speaking, this was not a cold weather operation, for severe temperatures were not encountered. The lowest temperature recorded aboard ship was minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit, at the base at Little America, minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and by aircraft in flight, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the ability of naval forces with only limited special preparation to operate in the polar regions was demonstrated, and much information was obtained and recorded regarding the type of operations. The scientific program was curtailed due to the short period available in the Antarctic, plus the fact that of necessity, priority had to be given to operational requirements. However, this was recognized prior to departure, and the scientific programs were adjusted accordingly. The task force commander is convinced that very real and definite advantages have accrued to the United States and to the naval service from this operation. However, many of these advantages will be lost if there is no follow-up. It is recommended that a definite program of naval operations be carried out yearly in the Antarctic. In closing, the strategic importance of the Arctic is today generally recognized, and naval forces must be prepared to operate in the Arctic. The capabilities and limitations of operations in the Arctic, I thought Highjump was the Antarctic, of forces ashore and afloat must be determined by actual operations in polar areas. The Antarctic is not now, and probably will not be in the near future, strategically important. However, it does provide a valuable testing ground where naval operations may be carried out with a minimum of international complications. Funny how that would change so quickly. The task force commander, yes, he expresses his gratitude to the attachments, although on loan, as he calls them, the recommended distribution list, and then he signs it, R.H. Cruisin. No official signature block. Typically in the military, you see a signature block. That's name, rank, service, at least, and then typically position. But interesting report. Well, we got the letter from the president. We've got this. I think that pretty much closes out our exploration for Operation Highjump. Well, that was easy. Just kidding. So reading that debriefing, it gives us the impression that they hastily threw together this force. They pulled these ships out of mothball. They threw together a bunch of crews. They didn't even have pre-war crew levels. They went down there and pulled it all off on a very limited timeline. And you can see where these forces went, and who exactly knows where the heck the carrier was and what it was doing. We have its task and purpose, but was it moving with one of the other task forces, or was it off on its own somewhere? Very interesting. And then, of course, the report seems to indicate that bad weather rolled in a little soon. The pack ice was coming in, so they had to withdraw rather quickly. But despite having to withdraw rather quickly, they completed their objectives. There are many inconsistencies with this report, and then we consider the president's directive and order to Admiral Byrd that nothing about what happened down here could be talked about. Nothing could be released. Everything had to be approved by the committee. So we've looked at the official account. Now let's look at the unofficial accounts. So what were some theorized mission objectives for Operation Highjump that may not have been released to the public even after the Freedom of Information Act was exercised? Well, based on first-hand testimony, which to share with you in summary is very limited. All the first-hand testimony from actual members of Operation Highjump indicate the same thing. It was a hastily planned operation. They didn't really have a lot of time to prepare the ships or the equipment. They somehow managed to pull it off, and there seems to be a recurring theme of no one really knowing what they were doing down there. Now remember, we had a presidential executive order which stated that nobody could talk about it, nobody could share any information that they had acquired down there through any means, and everything had to be approved by the committee. So that calls into question anything that's released from it. Do we know the whole story? I sincerely doubt it. We just looked at an entire debriefing from the task force commander, a very strange debriefing which seemed to contradict itself a little bit in places, but was nevertheless very detailed, and you can actually go through that debriefing and read the exact movements of every ship, and it's interesting to me how they want to make that very clear. I don't think I've ever seen that detailed of a debriefing, even in this modern era where we have computers that can track the movement of military units from start to finish. So there's that. Finally, they want to make it clear, especially the task force commander, that there was nothing in Antarctica of interest. At best, it's a training ground for Arctic operations. Because remember, in 1946 and 1947, somehow the United States seemed convinced that the Soviet Union was going to pose a threat to it, even though at that time, the United States was the only nation in the world with nuclear weapons, tested and used in combat. Nevertheless, theorized mission objectives. Mission Objective 1, Search and Destroy, a Wehrmacht enclave, and the individual known as Hans Kammler, a very senior official within the Waffen-SS, who had been the supervisor as a civil engineer of the German secret weapons program. We'll look into that in detail. What's the basis of this theory? In 1939, around the same time frame that the order was given to Admiral Byrd, there was a confirmed German expedition to the Antarctica. And we have that map pictured right here, which shows the piece of land from that map called New Swabia. This map is clearly in German because you have the K's for the C's, and interestingly enough, they even refer to Byrd over here. I don't know, maybe a crazed regime such as the Third Reich had admiration for Byrd, or that was just the name they went off of. Interesting nonetheless. The account for this, the mainstream account, I'm not going to bother putting it up for anybody because that account is a prime example of doublespeak and doublethink. The Wikipedia account contradicts itself. It says that the Germans went there in 1939. It says that they went there to establish a whaling station. It also claims that they did not make any territorial claims, yet that same site provides a map that shows you a piece of territory marked off. So what is going on? It's strange. Nevertheless, they do state that there was an expedition that went there. So unless they're trying to create conspiracy theories, which they may well be trying to do, because misinformation is definitely a great way if you want to keep people from looking where they're supposed to look. So consider that. But a search and destroy, potentially at the end of World War II, the remnants of the Wehrmacht, the defense forces of the Third Reich, had fled, and potentially an individual known as Hans Kammler had fled as well. And we'll discuss why he would be a person of interest for the United States military, and discuss some theories as to what's really going on. Establish a sovereign claim for resource exploitation. This is very straightforward, and this is something that we could believe. And if they would have advanced this claim, you have to wonder. There's also a little bit of back and forth, even though it states in the official order and the debrief that Operation Highjump was to establish a sovereign territorial claim for the United States in the Antarctica. Yet then they quickly denied it. So they go back and forth on that one. Just like they speak for the Third Reich, a very aggressive regime which had no qualms about using any means necessary to expand its territory, went down there and decided not to claim any territory. They just drew a map for fun, apparently. And then finally, and this is the most exotic and far-fetched claim, at least to the mainstream, search for access points to uncharted lands, inner and outer access points. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to it. Evaluate the threat and accessibility. And there's connections with the Philadelphia experiment right there. So what are we really looking at? I found this interesting that there is a board game for Admiral Byrd's South Pole game. Doesn't this look like a lot of fun? Go and find the penguins, move from Middle America to Camp B, head over to Camp A, find the South Pole, although that's not the magnetic South Pole, but that's the geographic South Pole. I guess there's a big difference. Don't get lost in the blizzard. Doesn't this look like a lot of fun? Kind of reminds me of the game of life. Maybe you could get your Admiral Byrd action figure and put him on there and move him across the game. So just quite fascinating that there was a game, and it even has Little America on it. I mean, actually, some of the details on it seem pretty accurate, at least from what the official account says, interestingly enough. Oh, look at this. You even have signal going all the way back to the communications. And yes, it does look like this operation, according to this game, was being command and controlled from Washington, D.C. Fascinating. And now the big elephant in the room, and that is considering the casualties of World War II. And this is from the United States military site concerning Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Accounting Agency. In the World War II facts and figures, as of today, the total unaccounted for of American service members is 72,238. Just think about what that number represents. And if you go to this website, you can actually go and see it listed over 3,334 pages of names of American service members who are unaccounted for. Now, does this number in and of itself prove anything? No, it was a global conflict, it's true. But it's still interesting that many could be unaccounted for, especially since the result of the war that we're told is that the United States and the Allies decisively won the war, to the point that they had occupied their former adversaries' lands. So how could there be that many unaccounted for? And something else to think about, and whenever it comes to casualty figures, you always have to wonder. It means one of two things. Either this is an accurate or approximate number, or this number is either inflated or underreported. So it means either they're telling the truth, or they're trying to tell the truth, or they're deliberately telling something that's a fabrication. Why would they do that? Many reasons. People always ask that question. Why would anybody lie? Well, because just tell the truth, and everybody tells the truth, because you can get what you want by telling the truth. In any event, let's just take this number at face value. 72,238 American service members unaccounted for at the end of World War II. Now, that gives the potential that many different things can happen, and that also factors into supporting the theories for what Operation Highjump was about, and even falls into looking at the Philadelphia experiment. Let's recount the mainstream's version of the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment was an alleged event claimed to have been witnessed by an ex-merchant mariner named Carl M. Allen at the United States Navy Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, sometime around October 28, 1943. Allen described an experiment where the U.S. Navy attempted to make a destroyer escort-class ship, the USS Eldridge, disappear, and the bizarre results that followed. The story first surfaced in late 1955 when Allen sent a book full of handwritten annotations referring to the experiment to a U.S. Navy research organization, and a little later a series of letters making further claims to a UFO book writer. Allen's account of the event is widely understood to be a hoax. Several different and sometimes contradictory, because we never get contradictions in the mainstream account, versions of the alleged experiment have circulated over the years in paranormal literature and popular movies. They actually made 2 movies about the Philadelphia experiment, although not that I'm a film reviewer aside from pointing out connections to themes from the old world, but I'd suggest sticking with the first one. It has a much better story, just my opinion. The U.S. Navy maintains that no such experiment was ever conducted, that the details of the story contradict well-established facts about the USS Eldridge, and that the physics the experiment is claimed to be based on are non-existent. Ah, yes. Non-existent. So in 1943, nuclear weapons were non-existent, according to the mainstream, but in 1945, they were in existence. And 50 years earlier, jets were probably considered the concept of fantasy and non-existent, but by the 1940s, they were existent. So I guess we conclude that things are only non-existent until they're not. And one final note about the Philadelphia experiment, we'll just refer to when Carl M. Allen sent an anonymous package marked Happy Easter containing a copy of Morris K. Jessup's book. And Morris K. Jessup also falls into the story, and he has an interesting and unfortunate end, as you can probably imagine. Since the Philadelphia experiment is an urban myth, I can relay the story to you in my own words because it's just a myth. There's no copyright on it, and it's not documented, and it didn't really happen. Well, our urban myth begins with UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup receiving a letter from Carl M. Allen, the former member of the Merchant Marine. And the letter detailed to Jessup that he had witnessed an experiment that occurred in 1943 in Philadelphia involving the destroyer escort USS Eldridge. The details unsettled Jessup, and he couldn't believe what he was reading at first. It begins with the USS Eldridge being brought into the Philadelphia Naval Yard. The tests are to render the ship invisible to radar and potentially invisible to the naked eye, utilizing concepts from Albert Einstein's unified field theory. A theory that does exist on paper, but again, remember the official account tells us that it's non-existent technology and non-existent theories that involved in this experiment. But nevertheless, the crew worked for many hours installing the electromagnetic equipment aboard the ship for the experiment. In 1943, World War II was entering its phase where the Allies were considered to be winning the war, but they still needed every advantage that they could get. So the crew busied themselves installing the equipment, and many of them were excited about the prospect of being part of an experiment they were told that was going to potentially change the world. And the time came to throw the switch to activate the electromagnetic generators. The crew waited with bated breath, and the admirals observing waited to see what would actually happen. Strange electromagnetic effects began to affect the crew and the ship. They couldn't quite tell where they were. Their vision became blurry. But to the independent observers on other ships in the shore, they saw that the ship slowly started to disappear. A strange cloud appearing over it with the electromagnetic effects. And finally, the ship became completely invisible. The experiment had worked. The technology was effective. There was a celebration on shore and with the admirals. They now had a weapon that would decisively change the face of surface naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century. Then something strange happened. Only minutes after deactivating the generators, the ship and the crew just started to disappear or phase out of existence. Some reports say that the ship was transported to another port, Norfolk, and other reports, more credible, seem to indicate that the ship just simply disappeared where it was, and it was gone for several minutes. Finally, the ship reappeared with the crew, and the crew instantly showed effects of total sickness, disorientation, nausea, vomiting. And yet, that wasn't the worst of it. The lucky ones went mad, and they were confined to asylums for the remainder of their lives. And the unlucky ones found themselves living out their lives in solitary confinement and isolation, constantly phasing in and out of the dimension, randomly disappearing for minutes at a time, and then reappearing. Allen relayed to Jessup that he knew of several crew members who were now being studied as human guinea pigs and spent the remainder of their lives reduced to this status. Allen was appalled at what he'd learned and believed that both he and Jessup needed to make the world aware of what had happened. This was terrifying that an allied nation would resort to using human beings as guinea pigs, and yet that was how the story ended. There are more facts to look into with what happened with both Allen and Jessup, as they're the two proponents of the story. But it should be noted that in 1984, it was made into a film, The Philadelphia Experiment, with Michael Parr and Nancy Allen, and it is a very good science fiction film, in my humble opinion. I wonder if Carl M. Allen was ever paid any royalties, since this was just an urban myth that he had created. Or maybe the real conspiracy here is this is just Hollywood trying to find a way not to pay someone royalties for a screenplay. Well, I don't think that's the case. In any event, let's take a look into the details behind the individuals involved with the story, and let's take a look at how it factors back into Operation Highjump. I do not believe that any of the crew that were on the USS Eldridge, if it in fact did happen, were part of Operation Highjump. I think the end of the story is very accurate if they were all confined, whether it was in asylums, the ones who weren't cursed with the interphasic dimensional existence, and it sounds like something out of Star Trek, doesn't it? But the ones who were confined. But nevertheless, the technology came into play, and that's what we're going to examine. So let's look at the origins of the Philadelphia experiment and the individual who claimed to have witnessed it initially, Carl Meredith Allen. Carl Meredith Allen was an American merchant marine who claimed that during World War II he witnessed the Philadelphia experiment, a supposed paranormal event where the United States Navy made a ship invisible and accidentally teleported it through space. The story is widely understood to be a hoax perpetrated by Allen, something he confessed to several times over the years, then recanted, then confessed to again. Wait a minute, let me get this straight. So he told this story, he recanted the story, then he recanted the recant, and then he recanted the recant of the recant. That sounds like something the mainstream would tell us. When we look at his biography, and it seems to be relatively normal, he's described as a brilliant mind, but he's somebody who never held a job for long and was a drifter. Somehow he ended up in the United States Marine Corps during World War II, but he was discharged. Then he ended up in the United States Merchant Marine, serving on many ships until 1952 when he left the service. So obviously he was competent enough to remain in the United States Merchant Marine, but nevertheless he claimed to witness the Philadelphia experiment, and then it also says that he had many other aliases and one time wrote to the rocket engineer Werner von Braun, turned up in various places, and then he died without really any kind of issue in 1994. So no one of consequence, and we don't really have a lot to say about him, just that he came up with this kooky story and that he just had a fantastic mind, but he was known as a master leg puller, pulling pranks on people or to get out of work in general. Again, I still wonder how he lasted in the United States Merchant Marine that long, but nevertheless, I'm sure perhaps they were just making exceptions for him. So, well, let's look at the person that he wrote to, Morris K. Jessup. Morris K. Jessup was an American ufologist. He had a Master of Science degree in astronomy, and though employed for most of his life as an automobile parts salesman and a photographer, is probably best remembered for his writings on UFOs. Wouldn't that be interesting if you found something like that out about Carl Sagan, if you looked into his deep past? He spent some time as a automobile parts salesman, or maybe even a used car salesman. Not that I'm saying that Carl Sagan would ever do something like that, but it's interesting to think about. Anyway, he was an author and was writing about UFOs in the 50s. Let's just look up at what happened to Morris K. Jessup in the end. Death. Jessup attempted to make a living writing on the subject of UFOs, but his follow-up books did not sell well, and his publisher rejected several other manuscripts. So I guess he just spontaneously lost his ability to write. In 1958, his wife left him and he traveled to New York City. His friends described him as being somewhat unstable. After returning to Florida, he was involved in a serious car accident and was slow to recover, apparently increasing his despondency. On April 20th, 1959, in Dade County, Florida, Jessup's car was found along a roadside with Jessup dead inside. A hose had been run from the exhaust pipe into the rear window of the vehicle, which had filled with toxic fumes when turned on. The death was ruled a suicide. That is quite an elaborate plan to enact for a suicide. Friends said that he had been extremely depressed and had discussed suicide with him for several months. And apparently they didn't really care to take any action or didn't say anything about it, but we go into the whole thing about suicide. Jessup's death would get rolled into more conspiracy theories surrounding the Philadelphia experiment, with some believing that the circumstances of Jessup's apparent suicide were mysterious. And then, of course, they refer to William Moore and Charles Berlitz's book and put forward a conspiracy theory that his death was connected to his knowledge of the Philadelphia experiment. Friends interviewed in the same book thought the bizarre letters from Carl Meredith Allen may have initiated a decline in Jessup's mental state, leading to his eventual suicide. Yes. So, guy who was a successful author, and then because he just happened to get letters from some random person with some random story, it just caused him to lose his mind, because that's just what happens. Imagine the power you could have just to come up with a story. I wonder if I could come up with a story about some military experiment from maybe the 1990s about transporting service members randomly to, let's say, Alpha Centauri. And it really happened. I'm going to float the story. I'm going to write some letters to some ufologists. Maybe I'll write Giorgio and see if I can get on Ancient Aliens. And then this entire story will go and have a life of its own. But then in the end, I'll just be credited as some person who was crazy, who made up a lot of stories, doing anything to get out of work, and, just a master tall tale or leg puller, as they described Carl Allen. And then, unfortunately, it leads to the demise of Giorgio. No, I wouldn't want that to happen to Giorgio, but nevertheless, it's interesting to think about that this is the overall story that they're telling us. So after looking into those biographies, let's look at the general synopsis of the quote-unquote science of the experiment, of the Philadelphia experiment. The experiment was allegedly based on an aspect of some unified field theory, a term coined by Albert Einstein to describe a class of potential theories. Such theories would aim to describe mathematically and physically the interrelated nature of the forces of electromagnetism and gravity. In other words, uniting their respective fields into a single field. Well, we know we're not trying to do that today, right? Not that device that we have, that large Hadron Collider has anything to do with that, right? We're not trying to unify anything to a single field. That's crazy talk. It's non-existent until it does exist. Another unattributed version of the story proposes that researchers were preparing magnetic and gravitational measurements of the seafloor to detect anomalies, supposedly based on Einstein's attempts to understand gravity. In this version, there were also related secret experiments in Nazi Germany to find anti-gravity, allegedly led by SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler. We'll look up Hans Kammler here in a second. There are no reliable attributable accounts, but in most accounts of the supposed experiments, I like that. They're not reliable, they're not attributable, but there are multiple accounts of the experiment. It's not just Carl and Alan, according to the mainstream, but maybe they made an error. USS Eldridge was fitted with the required equipment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Testing began in the summer of 1943, and it was supposedly successful to a limited extent. One test resulted in Eldridge being rendered nearly invisible, with some witnesses reporting a greenish fog appearing in its place. Crew members complained of severe nausea afterwards. And, of course, you see the reports that we already covered. So let's look up Hans Kammler. Hans Kammler was an SS Obergruppenführer responsible for Nazi civil engineering projects and its top-secret V-weapons program. He oversaw the construction of various Nazi concentration camps before being put in charge of the V-2 rocket and emergency fighter programs towards the end of World War II. Kammler disappeared in May 1945 during the final days of the war. There has been much conjecture regarding his fate, and they even say up here on the mainstream that his death was assumed. Looking at just this brief synopsis, we see that this is the individual who was responsible for V-2 rockets and the emergency fighter programs. And of course, there it gives you a very dramatic image. Remember that the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of the German Wehrmacht, were the first to develop the jet fighter, not even 40 years after the Wright brothers had invented a glider with triple axis control. Now, the disappearance of Kammler is very interesting, and of course we get his exploits, and being from Nazi Germany, he's a very evil individual and was involved in terrifying executions and human experimentation. And I don't want to gloss over that, given that that did happen. That's a very terrible thing. But his disappearance and possible fate is interesting because what seems to happen if you read through it, and I'm not going to, I'm just going to give you a summary, is that his wife seemed to be keen that not 2 months after he had allegedly died to have him declared dead. And that was simply based on the testimony of his driver and several other aides and members who knew him. He just seemed to disappear at the end of the war. So we have the individual who is responsible for developing the Vengeance weapons program of Nazi Germany, and also the emergency fighter program, who disappeared. We have other accounts saying that he was working on anti-gravity technology, and that's the connection to the Philadelphia experiment. And it's certain to say that none of these programs were happening in isolation, that if nations do exist as we're told, and that World War II is as we're told, that they were certainly conducting espionage, and we're well aware of their concurrent efforts. Now, there could be another story behind that, but we're not going to get into it in this video. We do have connections already to how this could have factored into Operation Highjump. And it is quite possible, and there are accounts, that Kammler and his entourage disappeared, fleeing to an area where they would not be found and would not be pursued. Because remember, Operation Highjump was conducted under very hasty circumstances. Oh, unethical human experimentation in the United States? Wait a minute, I thought only the Axis nations did this kind of thing. What exactly does this say? This is the mainstream. This isn't some sort of crazed conspiracy theory site I'm looking at here. This is Wikipedia. Numerous experiments which are performed on human test subjects in the United States are considered unethical. Well, no doubt, because they are performed without the knowledge or informed consent of the test subjects. Such tests have been performed throughout American history, but some of them are ongoing. So this is going on right now? Really? The experiments include the exposure of humans to many chemical and biological weapons, including infections with deadly or debilitating diseases, human radiation experiments, injections of toxic or radioactive chemicals, surgical experiments, interrogation and torture experiments. Well, we've heard about those. Tests which involve mind-altering substances, MKUltra, and a wide variety of other experiments. Many of these tests are performed on children, the sick and mentally disabled individuals, often under the guise of medical treatment. In many of the studies, a large portion of the subjects were poor, racial minorities, or prisoners. Land of the free, I guess. Many of these experiments violated U.S. law. Really? Some others were sponsored by government agencies or rogue elements thereof, including the Centers for Disease Control, the United States military, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Look, this is not my crazy conspiracy theory that I am saying. I am merely relaying what I'm seeing here on the mainstream account. The mainstream is telling us rogue elements, including the Centers for Disease Control, the United States military, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay. Or they were sponsored by private corporations which were involved in military activities. The human research programs were usually highly secretive and performed without the knowledge or authorization of Congress, and in many cases information about them was not released until many years after the studies had been performed. The ethical, professional, and legal implications of this in the United States medical and scientific community were quite significant and led to many institutions and policies that attempted to ensure that future human subject research in the United States would be ethical and legal. Public outrage in the late 20th century over the discovery of government experiments on human subjects led to numerous congressional investigations and hearings, including the Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission. Oh, thank goodness. I'm so glad to hear that those reputable institutions have put a stop to these rogue elements that were conducting these unethical human experiments, both in 1975 and the 1994 Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, among others. Yes, the mainstream tells us this, and what it's implying and stating directly is that in the 20th century, the United States government was all about conducting experiments on service members, on its general population, without reproach, it seems. And it wasn't just the Axis nations that did these horrifying things, although they certainly love to tell us that. It's quite fascinating that here we have it as the mainstream account that unethical human experimentation happened in the United States. I don't know. I'd almost rather that the Philadelphia experiment, as horrible as it was, be real and that this be just a conspiracy theory. It's just disturbing. So we looked in depth at the Philadelphia experiment. And then we verified the fact that human experimentation did occur in the United States in the 20th century. And according to that website, Wikipedia, our mainstream account, it's still happening to this day. But we'll drop that for now. How does that factor into our theorized mission objectives for Operation Highjump? There's a lot of validity given to the search and destroy mission. It is a fact that the Third Reich did explore the Antarctica, and this map does exist, and there is a plotted area of land on it. It's also a fact that Hans Kammler's death was never confirmed. They seemed to rush it through. And so there is credence to the theory that the individual who was developing the wonder weapons for Germany, and also their latest fighter program, could have fled somewhere in the world. And very likely he wasn't going to go to South America, where many former officials of the Third Reich fled to. So it does make it very possible and does give a lot of validity to the theory that Operation Highjump was based on intelligence that was verified that there was some sort of presence of Wehrmacht remnants and even possibly Hans Kammler involved. And that prompted the sudden mission or Operation Highjump to search and destroy and potentially capture Hans Kammler. And why was Hans Kammler such a person of interest? Well, for the same reason Wernher von Braun was. He had the knowledge, and there was probably many other things that he was well aware of, not to mention that, according to the Allies, he was a war criminal. Now, this is somewhat extraordinary because some people like to think, well, then if the Wehrmacht had access to extreme technology beyond just the jets that they had, if they had something like flying saucers, one would think they would have employed them towards the end of the war and employed them over Germany and not just simply fled with them. But who knows? Who knows exactly what the real story is? And we'll explore some theories in next week's final video on this series about what this means and what Hans Kammler could have been behind. but it seems clear that he was conducting anti-gravity experiments, and there seems to be some sort of connection with what he was doing to the Philadelphia experiment concerning the unified field theory. And what was really discovered in the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just the ability to cloak a destroyer from radar or visibility, render it invisible. It seemed to open some sort of dimensional gateway. And it's that dimensional gateway that factors into 3, searching for access points to the inner and outer access points. Well, we don't really know what the nature of the land or the world is. Yes, we are told what the shape of it is, and a lot of people will debate what the shape of the world is. And it's interesting to me how the debate seems to be more important than what's the actual reality. It's almost as though people just want us to debate, and people will get emotional about it, as people do about their beliefs, and that's understandable. That's a human trait. But if it is true that the Philadelphia experiment and then the experiments that Hans Kammler was supervising in Germany were connected and did provide some sort of form of dimensional gateway, then that does call into question, what's the nature of reality? Is there a physical land that we don't know about in the Antarctica, whether it's something we reach physically, or is it something that we reach through opening a dimensional gateway? That's something we're going to explore in next week's video. But there seems to be credence to that theory, and it's one of the main reasons as to why access to the Antarctica is limited. And we'll talk about the details on that and what happened post-Operation Highjump, because there was a lot of fallout from it, and the explorations didn't stop. Even though the mission debriefing said there was no strategic value in the Antarctica, the United States continued to go to the Antarctica through the 1950s. And oh, by the way, guess who was behind those explorations? Richard E. Byrd. There's one other thing I want you to consider. Because of the fact that we have questionable casualty figures from World War II and 72,000 that are still missing, how feasible would it have been for Admiral Byrd to have more task forces under his command that we simply didn't know about? I find it very interesting that the task force was documented in very extreme detail that he did have under his command, and it was very clear through the Freedom of Information Act. And of course, it sounds somewhat exciting. Yes, they went to this extreme land, although the weather really wasn't that bad. We had a plane crash, we lost a few service members, but that was that. The weather got bad and we left. So, nothing to see here. But what if he had other task forces under his command? What if they had sent more warships? And if you think about it, indicating and confirming that they did send warships with one task force could have been a very good cover to send more. And if there were more losses, like let's just say 400, 500 Americans died in this operation, how difficult would it have been to conceal those losses with the already large number of missing personnel? And that's if that 72,000 number is accurate. So in the final part 3, we'll look at these theories in detail. We'll look at the outcomes, and we'll see if we can ascertain exactly what is the true nature of the Antarctica and why is it limited to access to this day. And again, it could simply be that it's a very remote place, it's very difficult to get to, and it just happened to be the one thing that many nations agreed upon. Of course, the second mission objective, establish a sovereign claim for resource exploitation. There were statements made by Admiral Byrd saying there was a lot of things down there that could have been exploited. And we'll talk about that in next week's video as well. And at least we can rest assured knowing that if there was anything illegal, immoral, or unethical going on from Operation Highjump in the aftermath, we know that the Rockefeller Commission would be all over it. Well, thank you for joining me. Remember, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today as we explore Triumph at the End of the World, the conclusion to the Operation Highjump story. Recall that in Part 2, we came up with our theorized mission objectives for Operation Highjump, beyond a simple and benign exploration of the Antarctic. We do have a very thorough debrief that we looked at, and it has to be one of the most meticulous debriefings I've ever seen, and this includes even after wartime missions from a United States Navy that, according to the debrief itself, struggled to get ships operational to conduct Operation Highjump. They also made it very clear that Operation Highjump was a very hasty operation. It had little planning and was conducted almost as though it was a contingency operation. In other words, something that had to be done because of a changing situation. Looking at our 3 theorized mission objectives, which are most likely and which could we rule out? I think we can safely rule out Objective 2, establish a sovereign claim for resource exploitation. While Admiral Byrd did state specifically in numerous interviews that there were vast untapped resources in the Antarctica, for whatever reason, establishing a sovereign claim for that exploitation seems to be beyond what the United States was willing or able to do after World War II. And in exploring the end of Operation Highjump, we have to talk about that situation and that environment, because it seems as though this mission itself was about a paradigm shift for not just the United States, but ultimately for the entire world. And we'll explain that as we go. Objective 1 still seems to be something that could have a little bit of validity to it, because there are numerous missing officers from high-level echelons of the Third Reich, and it is clear that both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to possess the knowledge base. And it wasn't just Germany, it was also Japan. You can find a similar story with Unit 731 and General Douglas MacArthur's involvement with, how shall we say, acquiring that research for the United States purposes. Although, as we found out in Part 2, the United States was doing something quite similar with its own experimentation on human beings. So, Objective 1, it's possible, but I think it's more probable that if there was a Wehrmacht enclave, they very likely did not have any capability to resist the machinations of the Allied military at that time. Although it's a very interesting theory, and it's certainly a very appealing theory to the imagination. But we're just trying to go off of what we have available and what accounts we have available. Objective 3 seems the most likely, and that search for access points to other lands, evaluate a threat and accessibility. Or it could have been possible that the reason that the Antarctica was sealed off from public access is perhaps there's something else going on down there that they don't want anyone to know, and they also don't want to make it very clear to the general population. So let's take a look at that and see where we go. We recall that with the Philadelphia experiment, we ended up with a UFO researcher, Morris K. Jessup, who had looked into it and then suddenly committed suicide when his works were strangely no longer successful. We had a destroyer escort that was rendered invisible to radar and to the naked eye, and then also a story about how it disappeared in using electromagnetic technology and a unified field theory that naturally scientists and the official Navy account tell us does not exist. But strangely enough, aspects of it survive, and then the science was also used in development of atomic weapons and further development of atomic weapons. So, whatever you believe on what's real and what really happened, the official account gives conflicting accounts in terms of what happened, and merely adds more intrigue to what the real situation was. The experiment was considered a success for the equipment, and yet a failure for the personnel on board the destroyer, as they were sick, and many were rendered incapacitated and confined to asylums, which were still in existence in the 1940s, and unfortunately living in a sort of interphasic reality, drifting from one dimension to the other and having no capability for any sort of life. But perhaps this experiment, while a failure for the personnel, for the human beings involved, it did open the door to possibilities for access to other dimensions through gateways that could be opened with this same technology. And there seem to be many indications that these experiments did not stop. And of course, we have the accounts of the human experimentation that continued on these unfortunate individuals, the crew that survived the Philadelphia experiment. Of course, we're told this is all just an urban legend and that this would never happen. It's non existent technology, although the prospect of utilizing service members for human experimentation is not beyond the realm of possibilities for the United States. There seem to be many hints and indications that this could full well have been the possibility. Also, the fact that the Philadelphia experiment never really went away from popular culture. I mean, they made a movie out of it, they actually made two movies out of it. And it even says it in the tag, the experiment that should never have happened 41 years ago is still going on. You have to wonder if there's a little bit more in that, if they're saying something a little bit more. Again, it could all just be a coincidence, but if it's just a coincidence, it's quite a fascinating coincidence on top of a series of coincidences. Now let's look at the missing from World War II. And I've had more than a few viewers who were surprised that the number was so large from the United States military, having over 72,000 personnel that were unaccounted for after World War II. This would potentially make more sense in a foreign conflict in which the United States or the Allies didn't win, but at the end of World War II, the entire foreign nations were completely occupied. So it's very interesting and it's very strange. And again, when we talk about numbers, it's hard to be certain. And whether you believe that there's a conspiracy or not, it's always hard to be certain that your casualty count is accurate. Although, if you do look at the figure for the unaccounted for, they do have an entire list of names on this website. So it's clear that if they are just communicating something that's inaccurate, it's very detailed and it's very well documented. So again, it raises more questions than it answers, taking it at face value. Speaking of face value, looking at the World War II results, if you just looked at the casualties of World War II, and you look at comparing Axis casualties to Allied casualties, you look at the military casualties, essentially for every 2 Allied soldiers that died, 1 Axis soldier died. In civilian casualties, it's not even close. It's well over a 10-to-1 ratio, and more. And if you just looked at the results of World War II, it would give you the impression that the Allies lost. Not only did they lose, they lost badly. Of course, that's not what we know happened, or at least that's not what official history tells us. And there's always justifications for why there were so many Allied casualties, and we can say, well, the Axis were very underhanded, they didn't fight by the traditional honorable methods of war and conflict. The invasion of the Soviet Union was something that caught the Soviet Union completely off guard, even though we're also told that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union had a very effective spy ring and was well aware of the Third Reich's high command decisions, and yet they just ignored an invasion of over 4 million personnel in their country. And ultimately, that's where most of the civilian casualties and the military casualties from the Allied side came from. Fine, there's an explanation for it. But it's still strange when you look at it, and also understand that World War II was the last full-scale global conflict. The paradigm shift that started after World War II and continues to this day is you only have very controlled regional conflicts, which really only involve one nation or one nation intervening in another nation, but it certainly doesn't involve anything on this scale, especially with the geographic and the amount of resources that are being committed to wage a total war. Now, one could make the argument, well, the United States in its recent series of Middle Eastern interventions, especially in 2000 and the early 2010s, was enacting its old school gunboat diplomacy from the early 20th century, where they just decided to go and intervene wherever. And you can find a nice laundry list of places the United States intervened in the early 21st century: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and yes, there are many other locations that they intervened in, although there's always a justification for it. Well, it's an evacuation of civilian population, we're providing support, etc. Did you know that currently the United States military is the only military in the world that actually divides up the entire world into geographical military areas called Unified Combatant Commands? No other military in the world does this, to include Russia or China. It's just a fascinating observation to be aware of. Now, I show this. This discusses the situation in World War II, how the United States provided supplies. They called it Lend-Lease. They had many different names for it. But essentially, the United States provided a lot of material support to the Soviet Union during World War II. And that was considered natural and that was acceptable because the Soviet Union was an ally fighting against the ruthless Third Reich and the Japanese Empire. Nevertheless, it's interesting when you consider the fact that all this effort suddenly changed within the span of just a year. And not 10 years after the war ended, the United States and its new NATO allies were going to every effort to rearm Germany, West Germany as it were at that time, and to stand up an effective military force. And of course, these are all rational explanations. The geopolitical situation changed. Well, did it? It's a fascinating consideration. Take these examples of how the Cold War, as it was called, suddenly escalated at the end of World War II. In 1948, one of the most famous events was the Berlin Airlift. Now, the Berlin Airlift was prompted by the fact that the city of Berlin was in what was East Germany, facilitated by the Soviet Union and its allies, and yet the western side of the city was still controlled and governed by the Western Allies, United States, Great Britain, and France. And the Soviet Union cut off land access. And this was 1948 when this occurred. Remember that at this time, the United States was the only nuclear-armed nation in the world. And how did they respond to this very provocative action, this very aggressive action by the Soviet Union? Did they instantly employ nuclear brinksmanship and threaten to conduct nuclear attacks on Soviet cities? No. They simply did an airlift into West Berlin to provide supplies to the people of the city, and then the Soviets, being very reasonable, just decided to end it after about a year of an airlift. Longer or shorter, depending on which accounts you look at. And it's quite fascinating that that situation was allowed to persist, and yet you didn't see a more aggressive posture with the United States using its nuclear monopoly. Now, again, I'm not talking about a preemptive nuclear strike. I'm simply talking about the rational use of brinksmanship if these are two separate competing nations, two superpowers, that are vying for domination, or at least to instill their ideology on a geographical area, that the United States did not use, or even attempt to use, all the methods at its disposal. And only a few months after this Berlin blockade was resolved, the Soviet Union did detonate its own nuclear device, Joe 1, pictured in the top right corner. It's just strange and it's fascinating that the United States didn't simply issue an ultimatum. Either the Soviet Union withdraw from all of the occupied Eastern European nations in 3 weeks, or multiple Soviet cities will be bombed. And you have to wonder why they just stood idly by and allowed that to happen. It was almost as though the United States wanted the Soviet Union to have atomic weapons and to have a nuclear stalemate. Now, we know that's not true. But it's bizarre, and it doesn't make any sense, and it's something we need to think about. In the bottom right corner, you have pictured the B-36 bomber. And the B-36 bomber was another super long-range bomber, continuing the glorious tradition of the B-29, which was supposedly a strategic bomber that enabled the United States to carry a very, very prolific bombing campaign in Germany and Japan. And in fact, the B-36's predecessor, the B-29, was the plane that had dropped the 2 atomic bombs in Japan in combat. But the B-36 was a propeller-driven plane, and they called it the billion-dollar blunder because when it was developed by the United States, it was already obsolete once the Korean War started in 1950 because the Soviet Union had fielded the MiG-15, which itself being a development of swept jet wing design used by the German Luftwaffe in World War II. Well, how does that factor back into our story? We need to go back and look at the sad and unfortunate story of James Forrestal here on the left. James Forrestal was originally the Secretary of the Navy in World War II, and he was the first Secretary of Defense for the new United States Department of Defense. James Forrestal comes across as someone who was a very legitimate and very skilled national leader. And many historical accounts stated that he was one of the best, if not the best, Secretary of Defense, possessing the ability to work with Congress, the ability for big-time management, and an ability at war planning. and he was considered the most technically competent Secretary of Defense. Well, he had a very unfortunate ending to his career because in 1948 he decided to support a different administration. The U.S. presidential election, Thomas Dewey, the Republican, running against Harry Truman, the Democrat. Truman was the same president who had succeeded Roosevelt in his death at the end of World War II and authorized the atomic bombing in Japan. And yet Truman was still the president who seemed to be sitting around and allowing the Soviet Union to conduct whatever aggressive actions that it wanted to with a very limited response. And there was a debate between Truman and Forrestal concerning the equipping of the United States Department of Defense. And Truman wanted to go on an economic disarmament policy, even while the Soviet Union was becoming more aggressive and asserting itself on the platform of world politics. Forrestal disagreed with this. He vehemently disagreed with this. And when he came at odds with Truman in 1948, Forrestal had made an agreement with Thomas Dewey, who many suspected was going to win the election, and not just win the presidential election in a close runoff, but it was supposed to be a landslide. And you can see this paper here, which is very famous, that everybody thought that Dewey was going to defeat Truman. Well, I think James Forrestal found out the hard way that there's a different way that politics works in the United States. There is a very different function for it. And that's why I think there's indications that James Forrestal was one of the few honest leaders at the high level, trying to do the right thing. He ultimately paid the price because he had made an agreement with Thomas Dewey that he would continue on as Secretary of Defense when Thomas Dewey was sworn in as President of the United States after defeating Truman. Well, once again, a close election that seemed to indicate one victory went the other way, and James Forrestal suddenly found himself asked to resign, and then strangely enough, his difficult mental situation rapidly deteriorated. He was confined to a hospital, and he committed suicide. Forrestal was ultimately replaced, and Lewis Johnson, pictured here in the lower right corner, was his successor. Johnson was more of the classic yes men, or yes man, to President Truman's policies of cutting back on defense expenditures. And yet, despite the fact that they were facing a very resurgent and aggressive Soviet Union, the United States found itself completely unprepared and unequipped to respond to the Korean conflict. And it's another strange situation where if the United States had even half of the military capability retained from World War II, or even a quarter of it, when the Korean War started, the United States Navy told President Truman it did not have any ships to impose a blockade on North Korea. Imagine how different the Korean conflict would have been if the United States Department of Defense was ready for action. Now, the other thing that Lewis Johnson relates back to with the previous slide in the B-36 is he just happened to be involved with the company that was producing the B-36. He also started a long and glorious tradition of the mediocrity of the Secretary of Defense position within the United States. Because if you look back in history, how many secretaries of defense do people say great things about or have wonderful opinions of? Many just served the job and that was that. And then, of course, there's a lot of bad connotations associated with the position and the performance of the person. It all seemed to start here. And I remember there was even a quip by science fiction author Robert Heinlein, where he said in his book Starship Troopers, "No Department of Defense ever won a war. Look it up." Well, I'll let you look at our official history and judge for yourself on that assessment. How does that tie back into Operation Highjump and what we're talking about? What we're seeing here is a complete change in the world paradigm, because shortly after the Korean War, NATO was initiated in the mid-1950s, and a full cooperation of a military alliance to prevent the fall of Western Europe by Soviet aggression, which lo and behold led to a rearming of West Germany, something that was considered unthinkable for the longest time. The most evil regime in the history of the world being rearmed and re-equipped with a full military force. And yet there seemed to be absolutely no hesitation. In fact, even France ended up approving this measure. And then, of course, the Cold War would continue and escalate with Francis Gary Powers and the infamous U-2 incident in 1960. And I always found it funny that they posed for a publicity photo with this. And yes, this is Francis Gary Powers standing in front of his very secret U-2, because I guess if you're going to do a secret operation, you better make sure it's documented in pictures. I always found that funny. So going back to High Jump, we're going with the third objective, that the real objective was to search for access points to other lands, uncharted lands, and evaluate the threat and accessibility. Many of the comments that Byrd made seem to support that, and the actual actions of many of the nations that participated in the Antarctic Treaty indicated that that's what was really going on down there. Now, could it have simply been an area that they wanted to retain control over to conduct experiments outside the public eye? It's possible. But it's interesting how the timelines seem to overlap actual confirmed timelines, where cause and effect created a completely different paradigm than what many of the world leaders seem to expect after World War II. This is what remains of the crash from Operation Highjump, and I always found this picture interesting because this was taken in the early 1990s, and they say this is in the very aptly named Rockefeller Mountains. And I'll let you look around at this image and see what problems you may find in it, and please let me know in the comments if it's obvious to you. And if not, it's okay, it's just one photo. And this is another photo of the actual Rockefeller Mountains, and okay, it's possible the plane went down around them. I guess I'm kind of hinting at what I was hinting at in the last photo, but that's okay. But then we had a more recent photo where, yeah, I guess we see something over here on the horizon next to where this one plane went down, and we had the loss of 3 service members, the only documented losses aside from other instances in Operation Highjump. And what about our glorious protagonist, at least the ostensible protagonist from this story, Admiral Richard E. Byrd? Was part of the multinational collaboration for the, I love this, International Geophysical Year, IGY. I haven't talked about this yet, but I love that terminology. It's as though there's some kind of glorified clock that's buried underneath the surface, and once we dug it up and we look at it, it tells us what year it is. IGY is just another way to give you certainty and confidence that it really is the year 2023, or in this case that they're talking about 1957, 1958. Good side note there. Byrd was appointed as officer in charge of the U.S. Navy Operation Deep Freeze 1 in 1955-1956, which established permanent Antarctic bases at McMurdo Sound, the Bay of Whales, and the South Pole. This was Byrd's last trip to Antarctica and marked the beginning of a permanent U.S. military presence in Antarctica. Keep that in mind. U.S. military presence in Antarctica. Byrd spent only 1 week in the Antarctic and started his return to the United States on February 3, 1956. And a short while later, Admiral Byrd passed away in his sleep of a heart ailment at the age of 68 on March 11, 1957, at his home in the Beacon Hill neighborhood in Boston. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And while he has a very subtle headstone at Arlington National Cemetery, there are monuments and memorials to the man all over. Top here pictured in New Zealand, he has quite a monument to him, and in the bottom at the supposed actual South Pole, where he has another monument dedicated to him. So what's really the story with Admiral Byrd? Was he truly an insider who knew what was going on and was really carrying out what the guidance was for what was supposed to happen in the Antarctica? I would argue yes. I would argue that he knew exactly what was going on down there. He's one of the very few individuals who's been to both poles, the North Pole and the South Pole. Now today they have a challenge called the 3-Pole Challenge. I'm not sure why they add scaling Everest as part of that 3-Pole Challenge. And very few people have achieved that. You can look it up for yourself. You might be surprised to see who's on that list. They also talk about, strangely enough, climbing something in the North Pole, but I don't know what the heck you're climbing in the North Pole. It's just supposed to be a sheet of ice, right? It's not like there's a big giant mountain at the center of it or anything. Right? Anyways, that was the untimely demise of Admiral Byrd. Now, he had a very interesting career. He was just the guy who kept trying to retire. He was medically retired and was constantly called back to service, right up until before his death. Very intriguing. And what did we end up with in the Antarctic region? The treaty. The main treaty was open for signature on December 1st, 1959. Keep in mind that this is during the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union are at each other's throats, and it's nearly going to escalate in the Cuban Missile Crisis to an all-out nuclear exchange, and things get really shaky when the Soviet Union detonates the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated, which the shock wave was measured around the planet 3 times. Yes, they really say that. The original signatories were the 12 countries active in Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and of course the United States. These countries had established over 55 Antarctic research stations for the IGY. And the subsequent promulgation of the treaty was seen as a diplomatic expression of the operational and scientific cooperation that had been achieved. As of 2023, the treaty has 56 parties. So yes, in this Cold War going on, all this diplomatic struggle, but when it comes to the Antarctica, we agree, we're all in on it, sign it right now, and don't hesitate. It was the first arms control agreement established during the Cold War, setting aside the continent as a scientific preserve, establishing freedom of scientific investigation, and banning military activity for the purposes of the treaty system. And yet you can find nothing but continuous accounts of the United States military especially being very involved in the Antarctica. Now, of course, they will justify this by saying, well, we have to supply those scientific research stations, and military aircraft are the only ones that are capable of going down there. And of course, you know the question I will ask. Why? And Antarctica is defined as the land and ice shelves south of 60 degrees south latitude. Pictured right here, which is the limitation of how close anyone can go to the Antarctica. It is controlled access. It is controlled access then, and it is controlled access to this day. Why is it controlled access? What is really going on down there? Are they continuing dimensional experiments? Is the land and the existence of the land not exactly as we're told? Because if you think about it, why would anybody give us any kind of accurate map, especially of an area they don't want us to go? Just something to think about. And of course, we wonder what could be down there. We have the stories that, if we subscribe to the mainstream account in terms of the shape of the land or the realm, that Antarctica could be Atlantis and that continent drifted down there and there's amazing remains. And even some pictures that we were told were fake seem to indicate that. So it's one possibility. Yes. And let's talk about the shape of the realm or the land. And I haven't really breached the topic yet, but it does come up with considering Highjump. Well, I'll just go off of a little example that Carl Sagan used in his great series Cosmos, where he talked about being able to visualize. He was talking about what the shape of the universe is, because his point was, in discussing the universe, scientists say that the universe is curved, but unbounded. Whatever are they talking about? Well, he uses that to introduce the concept of the fourth physical dimension, or the hypercube, which he says applies to the universe, but somehow omits or doesn't consider the fact that it could apply to the land that we're on, because if we're in the universe, then it applies to us. But then, as his example of how to think about the fourth dimension, he talks about a second dimension, a second physical dimension, or a flatland, which was popularized by an author in the previous century. The problem, though, is that he uses this example of the second dimension to show how the planet could be a globe. The problem with this premise is we do not exist in the second dimension, Carl. We exist in the third dimension. There is no second dimension. There is no second physical dimension. There's the perception of it when you look at a flat map or even the flat screen that you're watching this video on, but it does not exist in a second physical dimension. There is no such thing. So he was utilizing a concept to show a concept that he wanted you to believe was real. That concept that he used was flawed and it was incorrect. There is no second physical dimension, Carl. In order to make apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Yeah, that's enough, Carl. That's enough. So, to close out the presentation, I just present this image from the movie Greenland that came out in 2020. And isn't that a remarkable image that shows you basically the entire southeast portion of the United States, the Caribbean? It's the very dramatic scene where the comet slams into poor old Tampa Bay in Florida. Now, we should just consider ourselves very fortunate that they don't use these wonderful images and this live footage to show us storms rolling in. Otherwise, we might be a lot more terrified of the weather than we already are. So you see, sometimes I think we're just a little too hard on the media. Make of it what you will. Why do I refer to this as triumph at the end of the world when the previous presentations were called struggle at the edge of the world? Well, it's simple. It's because those that made the decisions, the controllers, the archons, whatever you want to call them, they defined the end of the world at 60 degrees south latitude. That is the end of the world, and that is their triumph, because that is the controlled access to those lands. Now, we've talked about the possibilities. Could it be simply because they want their own little area to do their own little experiments? Possibly. Could it be because there truly is access to other lands, whether it's physical access, interdimensional gateways, or some other facet way beyond our understanding? Fourth dimension, right, Carl? Fourth dimension? And I'd also like to say that Operation Highjump did appear to be a contingency operation. It was something that was not planned. It was something that was done very hasty. Was that to cover for something else? We don't know, but we have many clues that lead to many potential conclusions, and we have more questions that we're going to explore going forward. What could be going down there? Was there more to the electromagnetic research in the urban legend of the Philadelphia experiment? Is there another physical realm? Are there access points to other physical realms? Or is it simply the fact that they just want our attention on Antarctica so we don't have our attention in other places? Like climbing something in the North Pole. But I don't know what they're talking about when they say climbing anything. It's just an ice field, right? Well, thank you for joining me. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.